Hello, my name is Deborah Hurd. I am the project coordinator for the 50th anniversary of the Department of Black Studies here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I'd like to welcome you to our first live virtual event. And this is in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Department of Black Studies here at UNO. Now, the department was established in 1971, 3 years after the establishment of the country's very first Department of Black Studies at San Francisco State University in 1968. Like at San Francisco State and other campuses across the country, the founding of Black Studies at UNO was a result of a nearly 2-year-long process of requests, formal demands, protests, and sit-ins. The pivotal moment came in November of 1969 with the arrest of 54 students who were sitting in at the chancellor's office. Now, the students known as the Omaha 54 galvanized the students at UNO and Omaha's Black community. And it was that galvanization that resulted in the department's creation. And it is that history that we are here to celebrate. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that UNO sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American Omaha people, and we stand in solidarity with them. We also stand in solidarity with the people of Haiti in the aftermath of the devastating earthquake of August 14th and the ensuing humanitarian crisis there on the island of Haiti and here on our southern border. Contributions are still needed for their efforts to reclaim and reestablish themselves. If you go to our homepage, Black Studies Department, there's a statement on Haiti with a list of relief agencies where you can make contributions. So it's my honor to introduce our two speakers for today. Dr. Jennifer Harbour has a BA in English and History from Central Michigan University, a master's in history from George Washington University, and a PhD in history from the University of Iowa. She started in the Department of Black Studies in 2013. She teaches the Introduction to Black Studies, a series of African-American histories, sections 1, 2, and 3, the history of modern Africa, and a new special topics course on the history of genocide and child soldiers, slaves in modern Africa. She's the newly appointed director of Ombud Services. She's an associate professor here in the department, as well as in women's and gender study. She is graduate faculty and affiliate faculty with the Goldstein Center for Human Rights. Our discussant today will be Dr. Cynthia Robinson. Dr. Robinson has a bachelor's degree, a double major in Black Studies and Broadcasting from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, a MS degree in Urban Studies from UNO, and a PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Nebraska. She taught her very first class in Black Studies here at UNO in 1997. In 2000, she went over to the Communications Department, and she is now, she was appointed interim chair of the Department of Black Studies in 2011, and she has served as chair since 2015. So at this point, I will bring in Dr. Robinson and Dr. Harbour.
Hello.
Hello.
All righty. Thank you very much, Deborah Hurd, for those wonderful words of introduction. I am here with Dr. Jennifer Harbour to talk about her book, Organizing Freedom, Black Emancipation Activism in the Civil War Midwest. Welcome, Dr. Harbour, to our interview, as though you're not faculty. Welcome. All righty. So I just have a series of questions. We're gonna just have a conversation about your textbook that you wrote. Talk about your journey toward researching the history about 19th century African-American activism, and particularly Black women.
I was thinking this morning about this, about how early it started, my sort of fascination with the topic. And I think it sort of started with Scarlett O'Hara when I was a little girl, because I was exposed to the movie Gone with the Wind many, many times as a child. And I knew there was something wrong with it, but I didn't have the education behind it. So I knew it wasn't right because all the Black characters in the movie are caricatures. And so I think as I got older and older, I sort of did some more digging about what was going on in the movie. And I finally figured out that probably the only person in the movie that was like three-dimensional was Scarlett herself, because she was always complaining about her lot in life and she was very selfish and she was an awful person, right? So by the time I got to college, I started reading about the Civil War more and studying about it. And then I sort of went back to those characters, the Black characters in the movie, and I thought, there are no real Black characters in the movie, right? So then when I get to graduate school, I thought, okay, this is what I want to study. I want to figure out what people were doing in this time that aren't the characters, right? Like, so if somebody, by that time, somebody had made the movie Glory, which really fascinated me. And obviously that was more real. And there was still a lot of bad stuff coming out. And I was exposed to the original Birth of a Nation in film class when I was in college and stuff. But I really thought there is no book about that topic that I really would have wanted to read. So that's kind of how it started.
Okay, so how do we get to Indiana and Illinois?
Part of the reason, if anybody's listening out there who's in graduate school or who has graduate advisees, was that it was close to Iowa. And so one of them was just proximity, right, to where I was in the States in terms of being able to drive to the different archives, because I had to go to a lot of really small archives, on weekend trips and that sort of thing. But the other big thing was that my advisor, Leslie Schwalm, who had written a book about emancipation in the Midwest, or was writing a book about it. And I guess I didn't realize this until I was well into graduate school, was that we have always been taught that slavery was a North-South thing, right? And historians have been working really hard to dismantle that sort of presentation of it as an and or, right? That, and slavery exists in all kinds of places throughout it, well after the Civil War, right? There's still a lot of enslaved people who think they're still slaves. It's not like anyone's coming to tell them otherwise, right? Like, so the Juneteenth. So I was kind of interested in the Midwest because of Dred Scott and because of the parameters that didn't exist for enslaved people. So it was kind of a liminal space. So the Midwest was a place where slave owners went and they took their enslaved people, and their rights were protected as slave owners. But then the Northwest Territory is supposed to be free. So you had all these so-called free states like Illinois and Indiana, and they're not free at all. So it kind of depended on who you were, obviously. So if you're white, you're free. If you're Black, you're not free. And they also had bounties, so that if you are, for some reason you get free and then you're in the South and you manage to make it to across the Missouri River or the Kentucky River or wherever, you are still going to pay a bounty to that state, which could be in the hundreds of dollars. So they might be good states to live in theory, but they were really tough states for people to settle in as well.
So they were not slave states, but they were not welcoming to Black people,
Absolutely.
Free Black people. And James Lowen, the historian who just passed away, talked about this a lot in his book, Sundown Towns. And I have had students find Sundown Towns in my courses on race, and they have found a lot of Sundown Towns in Illinois and Indiana. And just to elaborate a little bit more on those two states, what makes them so polarizing racially?
Well, I think because they're so close to the South, but yet they're so close to the North at the same time. So if you look at Chicago, it has this wonderful, bursting, rich Black community that is doing all these great emancipating activities, and they have Black businesses, and of course they have their own Black Wall Street, right? So they have these wonderful neighborhoods where people felt protected, where Black people felt like they could grow and they could grow their families and their churches. To the extent that when you look at, well into the 20th century, and Emmett Till leaving from Chicago and going into the South, that's one of the reasons why he gets in trouble, right? Is because Chicago has good things about it that allow, and certainly it's still segregated, it's certainly still racist. But it's also, it can be a very good place for Black families to settle. On the other hand, the southern part of Illinois, as it is today, as well as Indiana, will later become white supremacist enclaves. They are today. I know that the American Defamation League and some of these other groups, they and the Southern Poverty Law Center, they find these white supremacist groups in Southern Illinois and Indiana. And I think it makes sense for those groups to emerge there in the 19th century because they're right across the river. But it also meant that the Underground Railroad had stops and way stations along them as well. So they really have this kind of dichotomy going on, especially in the southern parts of the state, where if you can get across the river, that's a good thing, but then you end up in this place that is still very southern. And I think evidence bears that out. So people tell me, my people are from Kentucky and Tennessee, but people tell me that they feel very southern having come from southern Illinois or southern Indiana, right? But then on the other hand, you have Indianapolis, and you have these other towns that African Americans are allowed to settle. And I say allowed because that means they're allowed to be there, but it's a very tenuous relationship, hence the Sundown Towns, right? So that there are Black communities that we see, and I talk about in the book, but it's a very tough situation for Blacks because, of course, they need to play by all the white rules and the rules of white supremacy in order to live there. Hence, you know, Sundown Towns and lots of different rules. So I wouldn't exactly call where they've settled, you know, a free place.
So we're talking antebellum, during slavery in Illinois and in Indiana, but also just in the country in general.
Yeah.
And you write about we need to rethink emancipation.
Yes.
What is that? Rethinking emancipation. How should we rethink it, and why should we rethink it?
My students probably get tired of hearing me talk about this. So it used to be that historians studied the Civil War and Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is supposed to be this big thing that happens after the Civil War and occurs in basically three big stages or themes, right? So you have radical Reconstruction, which is mainly Black leaders, and then you have presidential Reconstruction, which is Abraham Lincoln, and had he not gotten murdered, we don't know how that would have been. And then we have sort of this Reconstruction that is a big failure that is set out to seek vengeance against Southern planters and is a miserable failure in part because the South has been burned to the ground, right? So it used to be that people studied Reconstruction in that way, in a very sort of political way, which is fine, but that really doesn't tell you about how people live their lives. So emancipation to me, capital E, is really trying to move away from that idea of studying Reconstruction, capital R, right? So, and plus emancipation doesn't begin when the 13th Amendment is passed and slavery is abolished. It starts, for me as a historian, literally from the time that the first enslaved people start to fight for their freedom from the moment they step off the first slave ship.
And so is that emancipation activism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and emancipation, we used to think of it, I think, in ways that you have a white person who's giving it to you, right? Or a white person who's granting it to you, or maybe giving you the money so you can buy it, or you lucked out in the courts, or you lucked out in somebody's will. But when we look really close at emancipation activities and activism, they're Black-led, Black-managed, Black-designed. These are people, I always tell my students, no one is sitting around waiting for, no Black person is sitting around waiting for white people to come and rescue them, right? But that's kind of always been the narrative in American history, that emancipation is something that white people give to Black people. And we have thousands and thousands of examples that that's not really the case.
And so that's why you talk about an overstatement of white abolitionism.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot, I think, throughout American history, whenever I'm teaching African American history, I think that overstatement has been probably a big part of the white sort of master narrative, which is to say, oh my God, thank God for white people because they came in and they were abolitionists and they rescued Black people. And that's not what happened at all. And I can see why it would be part of that narrative, but I think now we're working hard to change that narrative. So I was telling my students, yeah, there are white abolitionists and there are radical abolitionists like John Brown, who there's a good reason why he was murdered, right? This is a guy who we probably think was for as best you could, closest you could get in the 19th century to white and Black equality. But even people who are anti-slavery and abolitionists don't necessarily believe in equality. So it's a mistake to assume that a Black abolitionist is the same thing as a white abolitionist. So they have really different motives altogether. And I think our focus on white abolitionism is really misplaced. And at the very least, when we look at both groups, we need to figure out how do they interact or not, and how do they motivate one another or not. And really, I always tell students, we're talking about a handful of white people, right? So, and they're in the North, and it grows, and it's important, and no one is saying that it's not important, but yet, if we don't look at that other half of it, then we're missing a whole bunch of what happened leading up to the Civil War.
And so you talk about white abolitionism, wanting to abolish slavery, but not concerned with racial equality.
Right.
How is that to be white, to fight for to fight for, against sort of the atrocities of slavery, the harshness of it, but also to still believe in white supremacy, still better than Black people?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a couple things. The first is that I think people who are white abolitionists were largely motivated by their religion, right? So you have the whole group of Quakers in the very beginning who are always opposed to slavery. So, and they're that special group in history that we can say, okay, so we're going to give you credit for this because there were some Quakers that did own enslaved people, but for the most part, that is a group of people who said, God says no, right? And then you have groups of whole swaths of the population in the United States at the time who approve of slavery by not noticing it or pretending that it's not there, or just by sort of going on with their lives and participating in this huge economy of slavery. That means that they are, agreeing to it by not fighting against it. And I think that's an important part of understanding the African-American sort of experience in American life, is because slavery is such a huge part of the capitalistic economy from the time of the Atlantic slave trade onward, that makes America grow rich, right? So you have both the economy as in wealth and power and the money that grows on like Wall Street. But then you also have every house that enslaved people build, everything that they do literally in the backs of enslaved people, to create this enormous wealth that America is able later to, pun intended, capitalize on. So there was more to that question.
So there is an interesting documentary, I think it's called Tales from the North.
Yeah.
And sort of what you're talking about, slavery, so, in Rhode Island, up in New England. Right. So they're not enslaving Black people anymore, but they are building the ships, the slave ships. They're doing they're heavily invested in the slave trade. And this family got really, really wealthy. One of the family members even was one of the brokers, they had slaves, but they didn't own slaves themselves, but they were. And so that's kind of what you're saying as far as that. And then so they go on this journey to kind of discover their own racism that have been hidden. They kind of what you're saying. And so do we see some of those parallels, not just even in Indiana and Illinois, but throughout emancipation activism? Do you see those in different parts of the North?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there are people who really talk about in their letters and diaries, and by this I mean white people who are struggling with this idea about what is happening is probably wrong, but I don't know that much about it. And so I was telling my students, I don't see it. Especially if they're removed from slavery. So I always tell students, so imagine yourself on the dock in, say, Philadelphia or New Jersey, and then later in like Charlotte or New Orleans, right? Who are the people that are around there, right? So not only do you have auctioneers for enslaved people, but you have people slaveholding pens, you have hotels, you have sex workers, you have entertainment shows, you have taverns, you have, like you said, shipbuilding. Anything you can possibly imagine once cotton becomes king is huge, right? So anybody who is in, it's the same way that you and I benefit from Walmart having terrible labor practices today, right? So we benefit from it, but we feel either very disempowered or we feel like we want cheap stuff, right? Which that's what capitalism does to people, right? It creates that class of people who really need the stuff that they provide. One of the things that does change right before the Civil War is the Harriet Beecher Stowe book. And I don't think I really understood it until I got in graduate school, that a lot of white people could have had the information about how bad slavery was.
You mean Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Uncle Tom's Cabin, yeah. Could have had the information about how bad slavery was, but really sort of didn't look for it. But then when Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, then they were kind of forced to look at it. And she exposed the brutality as much as she possibly could. And even Southern people wrote who didn't regularly beat their slaves, right? Who weren't into so much of the brutality went, is that really true? Because people are purposefully ignorant, right? I mean, a lot of white people are just looking the other way. So that really plays into emancipation activism, because then there are all these Black people in America, both free and enslaved, who need to get the word out. So one of the things that they spend so much time doing, you know, Frederick Douglass and all these abolitionists who are giving speeches and pamphlets in Black newspapers, really need to expose the horrors of slavery. Yeah. And also kind of try to have that moral suasion of people like, okay, you're really a Christian? Are you really sure? Because this is what is happening that you are allowing to happen.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the parallels between that day, talking about slavery, and today, police brutality.
Absolutely.
You know, having cameras that are exposing this, which Black people knew have been going on forever.
Absolutely.
But I read somewhere that Abraham Lincoln, when he met the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, said to her, so you're the little lady that started this big war, this great war.
Yeah.
Because she exposed so much of that. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so this is probably a follow-up to that kind of question. So race gets in the way. My research area is race. And how does race get in the way of white activism against white supremacy, right? Yeah. So how is race really, for whites who want to fight against, you know, white supremacy, white people who want to be anti-racist, how does race get in the way?
Oh, I'm trying to think, there's so many examples. I always think of the example that I always tell my students, so you're in the South, you're a person who maybe benefits from slavery, maybe you're a middleman, right? So in the economy somewhere. You're not rich, you don't own slaves, because most white people at the beginning of the Civil War do not own slaves. And you kind of know about it, you're not real familiar, but certainly you see them in town, and but maybe you had a dream one night like this is not cool anymore, right? Maybe you see someone being beaten. But for that person to then go out and try to debilitate the slave owning system where that person lives, is next to impossible. And I'm not excusing them, I'm just saying that the whole system is set up so beautifully, right? Slavery based on white supremacy, that let's say that person called the town meeting and they said, I really need you to rethink this, because beating people and sexually assaulting women and look at what it's doing to children and families, and just go down to the auction block and look at some of the things that happen. And even if that person was very persuasive, there's a couple things that are stopping him. One, in the South, and even in the North as well, is you never mess with another man's slave, ever, ever, ever. So there's this honor code, there's this code that says that's my property, right? So again, private property, capitalism is all really related. And once chattel slavery really takes hold and people are seen as property, then it's that much harder for even halfway decent human beings to say, how do we stop this? And I always think of it, that's one of the ways that we end up in a war, right? Because no matter how many speeches, no matter how many different kinds of people try to persuade them otherwise, slave owners are going to believe, you mentioned white supremacy, that they're now absolutely convinced that Black people are inferior, right, in brain and in body. And so it's gone on for so long that it is so clever. I don't want to give them any really credit for the creation of slavery and white supremacy, but it's so well done and so well built that it's really hard to get rid of. So that's just one example to me of how race gets in the way, right? Because they can't, and so there are a lot of abolitionists who make the case that Wouldn't it be nice if we treated each other like people, right? Like we're all human beings, children of God, especially since there have been some changes in religion and Christianity. But they don't see those two societies melding together, right? So to convince people otherwise is really difficult for 100 different reasons. And that is just one of the reasons. So the emancipation activists in the book spend a lot of their time attempting to look as if they are, so modeling white society, right? So they have political organizations, they have voting, they have democratic organizations that look just like Thomas Jefferson thought about it, right? So then that is one of the ways that they want to say, hey, we're just like you. It doesn't always work, and that's just sort of one method, but that's one of the ways that I think they think about how they can make this happen.
So I'm kind of on that train. Let's talk about Black codes during slavery.
Right.
And you are free. I'm free. I live in Indiana, Illinois, one of those two states that you talk about in your book. I can vote. No. I'm free to do what? What am I free to do?
Very little, actually.
Yeah. I'm not enslaved.
Right.
But now we have the Fugitive Slave Law. Right. So how does that affect me?
So you as a Black person living in, it changes over time, right? So once you get to the Fugitive Slave Law, things change in a big way. So I talk about that in the book. But let's say before 1850, one of the things that the Black activists in my book do that I love about them is that they go about creating their own institutions without any kind of white approval. So they build churches, and by that I mean the actual building, and then they put Sunday schools in there. So that's pretty much the most important thing that they do.
And that's their way of fighting against the Black codes.
Yeah, because I mean, they're the Black codes are usually monetary, right? So you have to pay that bounty to get into the state. Very often you have to have papers, so it's really tricky. So you have to have your free papers to prove that you're free. And frequently, in order to get into the state, you have to have someone testify you, or two people testify for you that are white, by the way, and say that you're a fine, upstanding citizen. So actually, I start the book with a couple women who went through that process. But ironically, or maybe not ironically, the ones who are most successful are the ones who have some middle class money, right? So it's important that, and I point this out in my book, that there are middle class Black communities, and a lot of them in Chicago, Indianapolis, the bigger cities, Detroit. And then there are more working class and poorer people. And the middle class kind of comes in to help out so those working class people, because without the money, you can't even buy the lumber to put the church together, right? So then schools, right? And so, and there are several other books now on emancipation fights in schools. In other words, that separatism, African Americans have to respond to that because they want their children to go to school, and they pay taxes where they live for the schools, but their children aren't allowed to attend them. So I would say the response is very proactive, right? It's very, oh, fine, we'll just put together our own school. Or we'll put together our own church or own business or whatever. So those little enclaves kind of are there. And there are some white people in my book who do, I think, try to make the best of it. But it's the legislators, it's the state government in Indiana, in Illinois, in Michigan, in Minnesota, and those territories who make the laws really difficult for Black people to come in and live, because there's still that persistent myth about how, it's amazing how we see it today, right? There's that persistent myth that you're going to be a draw on the society or on the economy, right? Same deal that we have with immigrants today, which is, no, you can't come here because then you're going to cost us money, rather than looking at that person as doing jobs that nobody else wants to do, or bringing their culture to the communities or anything like that. So it's really a very uphill battle that they have to move into those states. And I would say the other thing too, I think, is we always think in terms of free people and enslaved people, but there's groups of people who have been both, right? There are free Blacks who are born free, right? And who live kind of like in 12 years a slave, and who live in the North and are part of these growing communities and have some degree of wealth and power. But then there are a lot of people who were slaves, born slaves, and who were manumitted or emancipated or ran away or whatever the case may be. And so there's this whole group of people that I think we need to talk about in a better way. And so you know, that's why I just say Black people or African Americans, because They each have their own unique story. So, and it's not, so being a former slave is a big deal, but then once they get that freedom, what are the same sort of situations that they might be subject to that are like slavery, like being whipped, or it's very easy to find yourself in jail following the Fugitive Slave Act, because now then the Northerners are sort of complicit in helping catch any Black person on the street. Really, it's just a matter of time before someone who's even born free, or, you know, if you don't have your papers, or they burn the papers, or
Anything could happen, yeah.
anything.
So talk about Mary and John Jones and who they are and why you sort of showcase them throughout your book.
One of the reasons why I showcase them is because they became sort of this power couple in Chicago, and people in Chicago know about them, right? So many times I've been to Chicago to research their story. It's really cool how they're kind of these sort of hidden figures to us, but they're big figures in Illinois history. And Mary came before John, and she had been in Tennessee, and she had been born free, and her parents had taught her emancipation activism. So one of the first reasons why they're so important is because they learned this at their parents' knee, right? So there are generations of emancipation activists. John and Mary are special because he has a tailoring business, he has several side businesses, so they're able to grow money, and then they use that money for all of their different, you know, endeavors to help people. And one of the things I think is most important about them that we see is that they can kind of go on and live their lives, right? And just be, you know, when I was talking about that protection that Emmett Till had, it's sort of, if you have laundry services and grocery stores and businesses in that Black community, there's no need to leave. And so normally, right? And so that offers some safety and protection. So they could stay there, but they don't. They put together there's these huge meetings of Black convention movements that they go to. Women aren't allowed to speak, but I always loved watching Mary or watching her through history, because she works on the Underground Railroad and she hosts fugitives all the time. It was kind of hard to find that, that information, but she is one of those women who, you know, kind of every great man, there stands a woman. So I think, and there's a chapter in the book about women because they're so often lost to us because they aren't the people that give speeches at the conventions, right? Or they're not listed on the rolls at the conventions.
Especially Black women.
Oh, absolutely, right? So, I mean, even Rosa Parks didn't get to give a speech. So what I love so much about them is they're doing all this wonderful stuff. And when I say wonderful stuff, I mean literally everything from feeding people and taking care of babies all the way up to transcribing notes and helping print pamphlets and newspapers and doing the real intellectual work of emancipation activism. So when I first started the book, there was so much about Black club women at the turn of the century, especially in big cities like Chicago. And they're so impressive, right? Because they become involved in temperance and literary societies, and Mary Church Terrell and this whole group of these amazing women who want people to vote or become invested in voting, even if they themselves can't do the vote, right? Invested for their families. But when you look back, when I started looking back for women who came before those club women at the turn of the century, they're the women in my book who, and they range from the poorest women who are working 3 jobs and have, 10 mouths to feed, all the way to someone like Mary Jones, who is kind of the matriarch of the Black activist community in Chicago. And it really led me to finally understand that, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but there are tons and tons of Black people in the country before the Civil War who are fighting for the end of slavery, who have very little to do with slavery. You know what I mean? So they're somewhat removed. They're all the way in Chicago. St. Louis and Missouri has slaves, but who, when you look at their lives, they're doing okay, right? But they are not okay because they don't think this is okay. So they spent all this time talking about slavery and thinking about slavery, not just for their grandparents and the grandparents before them, but certainly for their African ancestors and African elders. So they know where people came from. They know about Africa. They know about the damage that has done to their culture. Certainly they're very religious, and so they believe they ought to help save people. So John and Mary are 2 of those people that I know there are more of them, right? that we could talk about that, we have some names, but basically the idea is that there's this group of fairly well-to-do Black leaders who really want to help end slavery. And so they reach out in, I think, magnificent ways in this period to really kind of get that war going, right? And really get that, they want to be part of that rhetoric that will eventually then reach Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln doesn't really come to these ideas about emancipation on his own. It takes Frederick Douglass and his buddies going to the White House to say, dude, just in the way Lyndon Johnson would have been convinced, so too does Abraham Lincoln, who definitely does not believe in equality, but at some point it's like, for various reasons, has to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So they are a catalyst. All those people are an important catalyst for what really happens in Washington.
And so the whole point of your book is that Black people fought for Black freedom.
Yes.
That's the whole point of your book. Now, talk about your research with letters from Black women during wartime.
Yeah. So those are in the National Archives.
How did you get involved in that?
I always wondered what Black women were doing.
During wartime?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, during...
And that maybe goes back a little bit to the Scarlett O'Hara idea, because I literally wanted to know what they were doing. And I know many of them were slaves and they're waiting on the Scarlett O'Haras, and I get that part. But I literally wanted to know, when they got up out of bed in the morning, even if they were enslaved people, what are they doing? Are they making clothes? They're taking care of their kids. They're married. They're not married. Like, what are they doing?
Why did you want to know that?
Because I think it's important to any African-American historian to know how real people live their lives, quite apart from the famous Frederick Douglasses, right? Because I want to be able to tell my students, this is what people do and this is how people live. Even down to, chamber press, we want to know what their lives look like, so we can appreciate what they were up against at the very least, right? So I got into studying Black soldiers, and there's this treasure trove of documents about Black soldiers, and there's the movie Glory. And one of my all-time favorite movie scenes is when they march into the South, and one of the older soldiers turns around and sees a young enslaved boy in the street, and he says, "Remember what you saw here today." And that always moved me so much. And I thought, okay, but I know they have wives and mothers and sisters and babies. So are they left behind? Do the women go with them? So when I was in George Washington University, I studied with a woman whose specialty was women in war. And she had all these great stories about all these things that women had done throughout history. So, Russian women fighting, in aircraft, right, during World War II. And that's not really an American thing, right? We didn't let women into combat till like yesterday, right? So did women fight? Did they have guns? So I really got into these letters to see what women were saying, and they had a variety of things to say. But amazingly, one of the things that I found was that they didn't necessarily think this great experiment with Black men becoming soldiers was a great thing, because they had to give up their husbands, which was a wage earner. And it was not so much the I love him and I want him to come home, but like, I have all these babies to feed. Or extended kinship networks, taking care of two grandmas and taking care of Uncle so-and-so, right? So that emerges out of slavery.
Now this is what I want to ask you.
Yeah.
How was that different than white women with their husbands who went off to that same war? How was Black women?
Well, racism for starters, right? So Black women are poorer, so they're going to be working 2 and 3 jobs, whereas a lot of the white women whose husband went off to war, they can, there's always this image of women in war, especially in America, women like rolling bandages, right? Or they're knitting for the troops. And my initial question was, okay, so white women have fairs, right? And they raise money for the troops. And okay, that's cool. I always thought that was kind of neat. But I'm like, did Black women do that too? And lo and behold, of course they did. So they do very similar things, but with a lot less money, with racism over their heads all the time. And they really have very, and this is the subject of my next book, which is the Black women write all these letters to Abraham Lincoln and the Secretary of War, and all of these people in the top levels of government. And they say, no, this is not working for us. Here are all the reasons why it's not working. My husband died, or my brother's gone, or you promised us so much in wages, because the Black soldiers are promised X number of wages and they don't get it, or they don't get uniforms. So they're really upset about the inequitable treatment that they are getting. And so they complain about it all the time. And one of my favorite things about them is that they read their voices really loud and clear. I mean, they're not shrinking violets here. They're not saying, oh, I couldn't possibly write to President Lincoln or, tug on his coat when he's giving a speech and say, here is my story. But when I started to look closer in American history, there's all these kinds of letters that women wrote to Roosevelt and Johnson, and they're pretty loud.
Yeah, because I know Gerda Lerner has the Black Women in White America, just full of letters.
Yes.
It's just full of letters, writing to FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's really all about the same sort of thing, just sort of, discrimination. It's all race related, and it is, when you read the letters, kind of like, okay, I believe that they can help me, And so how did that inform your research?
You make a really good point, because that's such a tricky part about American democracy, is that Black women are left out from the very beginning. Even when women get the vote in 1920, of course, no one's rushing to give that vote or the opportunity to vote to Black women.
But they have the most faith in the
Yes,
country.
but they still insist that they are citizens, or they should be treated like citizens. And I guess I love the faith of that, and I love the idea that they are not going anywhere. Because one of the exam questions I always ask my students is, so there is a liberation movement to have Black people go back to Africa. Why don't they go? Why do 99% of them say, no, I'm staying here in a place that has slavery? But they have established their lives, their families, 5, 6, 7 generations of people here who really consider America home. And they consider it, believe it or not, part of their job to fix what is wrong. And so in those letters we see, we see them complaining, but we also see them trying to put their families back together, which is, probably the worst thing, if there was a worst thing about the Civil War for all these folks, is that there's so much, people are scattered all over the place. So one of the things that Black people do in the book is they decide after the Civil War, or really during the Civil War, is they're going to use newspapers and churches to get the word out that I'm looking for so-and-so. So if you match those up together from the ads for runaway slaves, it's really amazing how they keep countering that. So there's always a counter to the white racist saying, my so-and-so slave ran away and here's what she looks like. And then Black women and their families come behind that just a year later and say, well, this person was last seen in this spot, and we need to move and make sure that, we build homes and communities for these families once we put them back together.
So you talk about gendered relationships, soldiering and masculinity. And in chapter 4, soldiering and emancipation activism, you state that ideas about freedom came to be universalized as male, both in language and claims to citizenship. When I was reading that part, I was trying to understand and differentiate between war is male dominated. Men start war, men go to war. So how is that different for how is Black men, or the call for Black men to come and fight in the war, how was that gendered in a way different than it
was for women?
But for men in general. Because war is gendered in general.
Absolutely. So, from the history of America, you have the protector and the protected. The women are the protected, the men are the protectors. And so it would make sense that all the females to this side and all the males to this side, and we have a very clear delineation about who does what, at least in theory, right? How it's supposed to look. So that's that Republican fatherhood, Republican motherhood, what mothers and fathers are supposed to do for the country, especially in the Revolutionary period. But that changes because it's kind of like women who the past 30 years in American history have been trying to get into combat. And they're like, we don't want it to be any special different from men. We want to be held to the same standards as men. We want to do, there's women Marines. It's like, I'll do as many push-ups, I'll run as many miles because I want to be on the same equal footing as him. And in order to do that, I'm going to do all the same things that he does. So it goes to that history of rights and responsibilities so that when Black men sign up for the war. I mean, you know, if you tell the story to a fifth grader, they'd probably think that was nuts, right? Like, why would you want to become involved in this war that people keep saying is not about you, right? That it's about all things other besides Black people. But they really feel like this is the place where they can vindicate their manhood, right? Where they can really chase that dream of having the rights and responsibilities to fulfill, because then that gets them on juries, it gets them voting, it gets them to have equal footing in businesses, to have all those promises of America. So they're still chasing that. But the difference is, and you're talking about gender, all these units long before Lincoln agrees to it. Because they really feel like this is their responsibility as an American. So they see things definitely as, you know, America gives to me this freedom and democracy and all these great ideals. In response, I give her these things. It's a little sad to me in a way, because it's sad to see Black men writing about this, because from my vantage point now in the 21st century, I go, how sad is that? Because we know what happens after the Civil War, right? We know that in many ways things get worse, and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and all this stuff. But I think that they really feel very prescient. They feel very in the situation at the time, and they feel like they have a unique responsibility and chance to really prove that they're just like white men, right? That they're just as brave, that unfortunately that their bodies are just as worthy of being blown up as the white men are. So does that answer your question?
Sure. And also, you know, Black people knew they were fighting for their freedom.
Yes.
Okay. So you say that Black soldiers are best studied as affiliated with their families. And I keep going back to what was different about Black men fighting in the Civil War, white men fighting in the Civil War, leaving their families behind. And Black men fighting and leaving their families behind.
Money, labor.
And then you write about how Black women were sort of like pushing Black men to go fight.
And I think we need to take away the romanticism of the Civil War and look at what it really meant, right? And what it was really like. So if you look at, again, back to our Scarlett, if you look at Scarlett saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to be a nurse, I don't want to deliver babies, I don't want to be surrounded by people who've been blown up. There's certainly that quality to a lot of these letters. But one of the differences is that white men very often have something to go home to because their social class is higher, right? And it's the same in World War II or Vietnam or whatever, is that what's at stake in the war when you leave is so much greater for Black men, because their existences are so precarious to begin with in terms of money, in terms of labor. And if they use that war to fight for the civil rights, then when they come home, of course, we find this in World War II, they don't have the jobs because they're being punished for even getting involved in the first way. So in the first sense, so I mean, it's really dangerous for them to become involved. But they also so despite the fact that it's really risky in sort of that white supremacist society, it also means that they might have a chance to do better for their families. So not as many white men see it as, you know, climbing the social ladder or having a job that produces more money. So just like today, you know, Black and brown men are more often used by the government or the armed services. We'll give you an education, we'll give you health insurance, we'll give you these things if you then give back to your country in this way. But they have so much more to lose because they don't have much to begin with, right? So if it turns out to be a disaster, then they're really in trouble. Or God forbid, and many of the women talk about this, if you lose that person, you've lost a wage earner, you've lost not just a husband in the emotional and romantic sense, but you've lost men who can protect you, right? Because this is definitely in an age where it's good to have guns around. There's lots of sexual assault of Black women. So they're losing men as their protectors as well. And I think I say at one point in the book that you need every able-bodied person to work, right? So it's not, there is no leisure time for Black women unless you're someone like Mary Jones, and then you don't even use that leisure time. You use that time to then turn it into activism. So I think about the people in this book and how hard they worked, whether they were the person having the fairs and they're selling their little cupcakes to people to make money, or whether they end up working 3 jobs because their husbands went to war. Whatever it is they're doing, everybody is working. Everybody has a job to do.
Do you see parallels between 19th century Black codes, free people, and 20th century Jim Crow
Absolutely.
on free people?
Yeah.
What are some of those parallels?
Absolutely. Well, so one of the big things is you can't be a vagrant. God forbid if you don't have a job and a home and an address.
People who were kidnapped, forced to come over, the descendants of these people.
Yeah.
And they wrote about that in the Emancipation Proclamation, actually.
Yeah.
Don't be lazy,
Yeah.
because that's what you are, Black people, lazy.
Right, right. No, that's an excellent point. Because, you know, for one of the things that Southern states do right after the Civil War is they turn to vagrancy laws and convict labor, right? So how do we have these 4 million Black people who are free. So we need to figure out what we're going to do to them or against them, right? So,
And we still need their labor.
right. So if we just arrest them in the street just for standing there, right? So that's one of the very early Jim Crow laws. And then we make up some arrests and then we move to the next county and the next thing you know, he's in Louisiana State Penitentiary. Then that worked for us because we made a lot of money. So I don't know that the states of Illinois and Indiana think of themselves necessarily as making a lot of money, but they definitely don't want what the South has. So that's another way that white people are really afraid of getting involved in this whole slaveholding thing, so that by putting up these barriers, especially in terms of the bonds and not sitting on juries and not voting, yeah, I mean, the only thing that the Blacks really have access to outside of Black codes is paying taxes. They still have to pay their taxes for the schools their children can go to.
Yeah.
And by the end of the century, and there's all these laws and all these fights about school segregation. So it's not just Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, there's all these antecedents before Brown of Black people saying, why if I'm paying taxes, why can't my kid go to the school?
And so there are parallels between 19th century Illinois and Indiana.
Sure.
And 20th century Mississippi and Alabama.
Absolutely. And there are today.
Yes. Okay, so we're almost out of time. Freedom, your book is called Organizing Freedom, Black Emancipation Activism in the Civil War Midwest. Freedom is used throughout your book. Do you think that the fight for freedom was won?
Temporarily.
Okay.
I think that they knew that they needed to abolish slavery in a legislative way. They needed it to get it on paper. And unlike you and I, they couldn't look into the future and see what was happening. So that's why Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy and Jesus end up on the Black houses, right? Because they do look at Lincoln as helping them get the emancipation that they so desperately wanted. I think they think their fight will always go on, right? Because they're very Christian, and that fight just, the Jubilee has come, but there's so much more work to be done after that. But I think that when they think about their society and look at what's coming next, they want people out of change, which is very smart of them, right? Because it's like, well, we can't do anything if human beings are owned as chattel slavery. And they also know that so many more generations of slaves are being created by natural reproduction and by having women being assaulted all the time, that they have to stop that. There has to be a way to stop that constant new, slave crop, right? So they have certain really concrete goals. And I think they know the fight is long, especially the people who are coming out of slavery, the 4 million people who are coming out of the South. Right, so they haven't had a taste of that in Chicago. And I mentioned Emmett Till again, because I think that's a perfect example of this kid not knowing what he's getting into. And so we always talk about how there are slaves in the North and there are free people in the South, but yet there is still that demarcation that makes the South so much more violent and brutal for Black people that there is a little bit of a different approach, right? So John and Mary Jones are talking about freedom for all people everywhere, but in terms of the 13th Amendment and voting rights, but then the people in the South are like, it would be nice to have freedom from not being beaten on a regular basis too.
Do you see your work, that's why you're a professor in Black Studies, and your research is on Black people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself as an anti-racist? And do you see your work as anti-racism?
Yes, because I see all my work as being empowering for African-American people, for Black and Brown people. So, and I try to keep my own whiteness out of it, right? So I'm very aware of the kind of white gaze there.
Do you find yourself in conversations with whites about Black histories in Nebraska? Do you find yourself, in conversations in this state that we live in?
Yeah, but they still think that white people do white history, Black people do Black history, right? So they still, and they don't realize they're doing it, right? They still think of as Black history only belonging to Black people, which is ridiculous, right? Because it's American history and it's the history of human beings. So it belongs to all of us, right? And so we all have to account for what has happened in the past because it is so much related to today. So if you're talking about mass incarceration and George Floyd, so George Floyd is my responsibility as much as it is yours and my children's, right? So that is the country that we have created. And certainly, white supremacists and people with white skin have created that without even thinking about it most of the time, right? So they're complicit. And I think that we all have to kind of work, and I'm not seeing Kumbaya here, I'm not being cliched, I'm just saying that I think books like mine really are used to help students understand that there has always been fighting back, that there's always been that zeal to improve things. And especially for, the John and Mary Jones trying to help things for the poorer people too, right? So that you have a responsibility for a common man, or at least that's how I was raised, right? So that you have responsibility for other human beings. So just because your situation is good doesn't mean that it's like that for other people.
Well, anything else you'd like to say, you'd like to add to the end?
I'm trying to think of what else is really important. I already talked about emancipation. I think it's also really important that the story continues, right? So that, and I'll be working on that probably the rest of my life, but I think that we need to know more about how Black people were not just reactionaries. So it's not just, if you're given a horrible diagnosis, you react to that, and that's a horrible thing. But then you kind of wake up from your shock, and then you plot your life and you make your plan to fight back against it. And African Americans, just like Indian Americans and all manner of other minoritized groups in American history, put together their plan. And we don't know enough about that plan to fight back because there's this horrible story of racism and white supremacy, but we also want to know what happens after that. Right. So what do those people do to be empowered to not be just reactionaries?
Right. And I'm glad the empowering part for me is the most important thing. Yeah,
those are your ancestors.
I think that we're good here. Deborah Hurd.
All right, so I want to thank Dr. Harbour and Dr. Robinson for this wonderful discussion. This is so eye-opening, and it gave us just a lot of information. Tracy Bridgeford says the session was very informative and interesting. So, and I totally agree. I did have one quick question for Dr. Harbour, and it kind of sets us up for what's coming next. So we have, in your book, you talk about Indiana and Illinois, and they had towns or, cities at that point in time where people could kind of congregate. But I'm wondering about the connection between Black activism in Illinois and Indiana, and then in the territories like here in Nebraska, where it was unsettled and you had people moving to these areas that were unsettled.
Right.
So what is the connection between like the city life in Indiana and Illinois, and then the wild west of Nebraska?
So if you're talking about exodusters, that's one of the ways that historians like to think of them, as these people we don't often think about Black families in carriages and, you know, riding their horses, but they do that just the same as white people do, right? And they're trying to settle. So my first answer to that question is it's a heck of a lot tougher, right? Because they are building communities out of whole cloth. So they're literally cutting down lumber and building little shacks until they can get a good house together and that kind of thing. There are slaves that end up really far, enslaved people that end up really far all the way in the West, in California and in Colorado Springs. And some of those people actually find some degree of freedom among white groups because they're just kind of this ragtag group of people that made it, that survived to the West. So you have these small enclaves that grow. And I think the Exodusters are really interesting because their activism emerges differently because they're moving away from, you know, sort of that old American idea of what is democracy. And they're chasing that, you know, is it the white man's burden? Is it manifest destiny? And there's all these tropes about what people are supposed to do to sort of conquer the West. And it looks very different when Black people do it than when white people do it.
Are there any letters or any sources going back and forth between Illinois and Indiana, people that are active in Illinois and Indiana, and then people who are in the territories? Did you find any of that in your research?
Yeah, there are some, although it's more likely for people who went to Indiana and Illinois to leave altogether and go to Canada. So, I mean, there's more coming from the north, from Michigan, from people who make it to Detroit, and it has a similar community. So I talk in my book about these neighborhood associations, these police associations that help people out. And some of the stuff that they do is help people cross the Detroit River into Canada, or they help set up people on the wagons. Mary Jones does that as well. It's that they've chosen to go west, and if that's what you've chosen, then we're going to put together some food, some some jerky and some other stuff like that. So you can make that journey west. And so another cool thing about them is that they're figuring out, you know, is it Canada I want to go to? Is it the Minnesota territories, or do I want to push even further west? So yeah, there are.
Thank you for that. So with that, we will kind of wrap up. I will like to let you all know that we have another event scheduled for next Thursday. Our next webinar will be Thursday, October 21st, where we'll be talking with Dr. Catherine Adams from Claflin University. Her topic will be Africanizing the Great Plains, Black Frontier Identities, Sovereignty, and Reimagination. And this, fortuitously, not something that we planned, happens to be going on at the same time that the Descendants of DeWitty exhibit is going on over in the library, the Chris Library. So that will be up until November 7th. So we encourage people to go over and to look at the exhibit and to think about the things that Dr. Harbour has raised and what you will hear again on next Thursday, and to begin to think about how all of these trends, or how all of how all of this information ties in together, talking about Black activism, Black emancipation, and the move for Black liberation. So with that, we want to thank all of our audience for being here today, and we will see you again on Thursday.
Thank you.